God knows with its effects to the southern coastline, and finally Sandy in 2012 again flooded the northern coastline. In Grand Bahama, the usual incursion points are to the east of the island, an area that is known as the Old Nile Base. This area, which is very near to the northern campus site called Sound, this is an area known as the Fishing Hole area road, or the Fishing Hole area, and of course, West End. All four of these points are typically flooded in instances where the hurricane approaches Grand Bahama from the east and to the north. So our interest in some of the effects started when the UB campus moved to East Grand Bahama, and we were in close proximity to some of these changes that were going on in the forest. And so the objective of our study was primarily to survey soil and surge affected and unaffected zone, to measure and compare the salinities in those two areas, and to compare temporally the salinity before and after the hurricane events. In terms of vegetation, we wanted to evaluate various parameters as it relates to vegetation profile, density, richness, abundance, and also to ascertain some of the average ages of the trees in the forest, both in the surge affected and unaffected areas. We wanted to primarily estimate tree age in order to get a handle on the ages of some of these trees at the time of their death. We also aim to evaluate the recovery of the forest within a 2-year period. So we embarked on this study, and we reviewed some of the literature that was available to us, and the typical methodologies involved satellite imagery, aerial photography, as well as direct field surveys, measurements, sampling, and analysis. And we, of course, were able to exploit the field survey approach to our study, and that is primarily what we will be discussing in our results. Now, the field survey method has quite a bit of unique benefits in that it allows us to address very specific issues as relates to individual species and individual regions or portions of the forest. And so that is what we set out to do. Soil samples were taken at a depth of 4 inches. We were able to procure some historical aquifer data from the Grand Bahama Utility Company, and that, coupled with our analyses and our testing, we were able to use in the results of this particular report. So again, we randomly sampled or selected sample points throughout the entire study area, and these sample points lie into 2 specific areas. Areas that we define as having been surge affected, and areas that were unaffected. The unaffected sample points lie primarily in the middle of this graph. The surge affected sample points lie in one section to the east and in another section slightly to the west. I'm going to proceed through for the next few slides fairly quickly. The study plots, we elected to employ 2 meter by 2 meter sample plots, and those were aligned, oriented to the north at each of the points. Our total study area was 482 square kilometers. Actual survey plots measured 88 square meters, consisting of a total of 22 plots. The chemical analysis on soil samples were done using the saturated paste extract method. Aquifer testing was done on composite samples, and these are some of the actual tests that were done. Vegetation density and diversity, those were done, and we employed the Simpson's index to give us an indication of species diversity. Tree age was estimated using core samples and ring count. And so core samples were taken at stump height, and we used 2 different threaded cores based depending on the size of the tree. Trunk thickness and height were also done employing the clinometer and DBH methods. So, what were our findings from this study? Basically, there were no real surprises. We didn't find anything that was surprising to us. This slide shows the results of salinity and conductivity measurements on saturated paste that were taken from soils in the 2 areas. As a means of comparison, we simulated in the lab the saturated paste for a sample that mimicked the situation immediately after the hurricane. And we found that the conductivity was in this range, 37,000. The salinity was approximately 14,000 ppms. So, in summary, in the surge-affected areas, we found that the salinity had significantly decreased when we compare it to what it should have been immediately following the hurricane surges. In addition to that, when we compare the conductivity and salinity of surge-affected soil samples to unaffected soil samples, with those we find that the salinity was still somewhat elevated in the areas that were initially affected by the surges. In other words, even though salinity had declined, it was still significantly higher when we compared it to regions that had no surge impact at all. So the fact that we saw a significant decline was not surprising. That was due to the porosity, we think, of the soil. And so on average, the surges or the flooding above surface flooding remained in the areas on average of 2 to 3 days. Following that, the flooding had pretty much dissipated, much of it, we believe, directed into the water table. So where are the elevated salinities? Of course, the salinities are elevated in those areas that were prone to flooding. In the east, around the Missile Base section, and to the west, around the Dover Sound section. Salinity in the areas in between were fairly low or relatively low. So the fact that the soil salinity decreased led us to question what was going on below soil level. And we were able to obtain some data on aquifer well fields that were generated by the Grand Bahama utility company. And this historical data is shown in these two slides. So basically, we looked at calcium, we looked at sodium, and we looked at chlorides. And what we saw was calcium was pretty consistent between 2008 and 2016. But we saw significant fluctuations in the levels of sodium and in the levels of chloride. Not only that, but the peaks in those levels occurred shortly after the two hurricane events in 2004 and in 2012. And so what we gather, or what we concluded from that, is that, of course, as the flooding receded, the water tables then received elevated concentrations of salinity. So in terms of vegetation profile, we were able to observe 3 distinct zones across the forest. This is the image on the upper left is what we see in a healthy forest. The middle image represents areas that were under stress, and the bottom right image represents areas that were completely defoliated. We also observe that this migration between healthy to stressed to defoliation is still basically going on, and we'll address that in a few slides to come. This slide shows the relative frequency of the 3 major species in the forest: the pine, the poisonwood, and the thatch palm. Now, the solid black columns represent species in the surge-affected or dead sand zones, and the striped columns represent species in the live sand zone. Now, what this basically shows is that in the live sand zones, we have all three levels of pine species present: the pine saplings, the seedlings, and the adult trees. The poisonwood and the thatch palm are appear to be the predominant species as it relates to frequency. This slide is aiming to show the relative distribution in the live forest and in the surge-affected forest in a slightly different way. When we look at species count, in the live forest, it appears that the thatch palm and the poisonwood account for almost 70% of the forest. And that was somewhat of a surprise to us. And we can explain that because what was going on in our sampling was we were missing quite a bit of the adult pine trees due to the size of our sampling areas. In the dead forest, in terms of live species, this is more reflective of what the situation actually was. where poisonwood and thatch palm do in fact represent the major portions of the live species in those areas. And so we wanted to express this same data slightly differently in a way that was more representative of what was truly going on. And so instead of species count, we estimated live carbon mass in the two zones. And when we present the data in that way, we see that in the live forest, the various levels of pine species do in fact represent the majority of the live carbon mass in a healthy forest. In the surge-affected forest, we see that the thatch palm and the poisonwood are still the predominant species, even when we express the data in terms of carbon mass. So we believe carbon mass may be the better way to express this data in this case. Another question that we had was the age of the trees at the time of death. Now, we recognize that once the trees had died, there was no way to conduct core sampling on those trees. And so we decided that we would correlate age of the tree to the diameter of the tree and generate an equation by which we could predict the age of the dead trees where we still could get the diameters. So we generated an equation, the age, the y being the predicted age, x being the diameter of the trees, and we were able to get a slope and intercept from the live forest. And that's what we are showing here. Basically, the slope was 4.25, the intercept was 15.416. Based on that, we then predicted ages of the pine trees in the dead forest, where we had n equals 57 samples. And what we came up with was an average age of 40 years for pine trees in the surge-affected areas. Now, what that tells us is that for trees to develop in areas that are currently being affected by the surges, they must have been exposed to a minimum of 40 years of optimum growth conditions. And so the events or the phenomena that we are observing, we are observing those primarily after a period of optimum growth conditions that, in this case, pretty much means salt-free conditions. So we believe, and many of the other researchers that are looking at coastal intrusions believe that it is related to the global rise in sea levels. And this data was provided to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And as we can see, the sea level has been consistently rising since the early 1900s. And that, coupled with the increasing intensities of the hurricanes, could be attributed to what we are experiencing in our coastal areas today. So in summary, what are we seeing? Elevated salinities and elevated vegetation depth in flood zones following the 2012 surge event. That is the more recent one. However, we believe that these phenomena actually began several years earlier than 2012. The pine mortality appears to be greater than that of the thatch palm and the poisonwood. Also, the recovery of the Caribbean pine appears to be slower than that of the thatch palm and the poisonwood. That being said, we do have recent evidence of pine regeneration, at least in one of the areas that have been affected. And so this is a bit of good news in that we expect a resurgence of the pine in the future. The estimated age of 40 years, again, suggests that these pine were able to germinate and develop uninterrupted for at least 40 to 50 years. And that is consistent with when they would have been planted following the last harvesting period by the Grand Bahama lumbering company. So the surge affected areas to the west, the salinity appears to be migrating underground via the underground aquifers to the east towards these healthy areas. We see that in the salinity measurements of the aquifers over the years. We are also observing that in the profiles of the vegetation now as we go from the current surge affected areas towards the healthy areas. And again, there is evidence of pine regeneration. This is what one area looked like in 2013. In 2018, we see clear evidence of young pine saplings and young pine trees flourishing. And so it is expected that at least that area will regenerate itself. So, what do we plan to do in the future? We plan to continue to monitor the aquifer, and we plan to do that at the same time that we measure and record weather parameters such as rainfall, temperature, and we will try to relate those to the rate of regeneration of the aquifer. And by regeneration, we're simply referring to the decline or the decrease in salinity in those areas. We will reevaluate the vegetation within the next 12 to 18 months to again document any changes in the profile in the surge affected areas. And finally, we hope to conduct some controlled experiments aimed at establishing the specific salinity tolerance of the pine and to propose specific stress mechanisms for the pine. How do we plan to do that? We know that stress mechanisms can be short-term or acute, and those effects are primarily due to osmotic stress. The more medium or long-term alterations, one of the ways that, or one of the mechanisms could be due to cation competition. And in this particular case, we believe competition between the sodium and magnesium cations for the chlorophyll ligand. Those alterations can lead to critical physiological interruptions as it relates to chlorophyll development and overall growth. Oxygen depletion, that is also a mechanism, and that usually results from displacement of air in the crevices of the soil by water. So where there were air spaces due to flooding, water displaces the air, so there's less oxygen available to the plant. And so it is reasonable that magnesium and sodium competition for the chlorophyll ligand is quite possible and very plausible. Magnesium and sodium ions are isoelectronic, so their behavior towards the ligand could be quite similar. and they are quite similar in size. So the chlorine cake size is able to accommodate both ions. We will measure, therefore, the growth parameters in young pine as a function of sodium treatment. Basically, we will subject pine to various levels of sodium treatment. We will measure chlorophyll content using fluorescence spectrophotometry. We will measure crown dimensions, stem dimensions, and try to determine ion distribution within the plant tissue. And so this is an opportunity for us to really determine and document in a little more clarity the mechanism of stress towards the Caribbean pine as a specific species. These are some of our references. Acknowledgements, my collaborator, Mr. Seco McKenzie, the University of the Bahamas for some of the funding for the work, the Bahamas National Trust, who also funded some of the early work, the Grand Bahama Utility, for providing us with some data, and Adam Labs. Also, one of the main inspirations for the work was to provide opportunities to some of our students to get a handle or get an opportunity to engage in some actual research. So this is a group of first-generation students who are now no longer with us. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
No longer went to school, you mean?
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, mostly for the presentation.
Very ambiguous.